The first thing Ethan Carter learned about alien planets was simple. If the wind suddenly stops, something is watching you. The thought crossed his mind the exact moment the storm outside his damaged shuttle fell strangely quiet. For the past 10 minutes the wind had screamed across the frozen plains like a freight train, rattling the hull and coating the cockpit glass with layers of glittering ice. Now there was nothing but silence. Ethan exhaled slowly, fogging the cracked display in front of him. The temperature warning on his suit flickered, -62 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. Well, he muttered, rubbing his gloved hands together. That could be worse. His shuttle had crash-landed an hour earlier after a navigation glitch knocked half the guidance systems offline. One moment he'd been charting mineral deposits from orbit, the next he'd been skidding across an endless field of blue-white snow like a hockey puck. The hull had survived. Barely. The engines, however, were finished for the night. Ethan pushed open the side hatch and stepped out into the alien twilight. Snow crunched beneath his boots, sharp as broken glass. The sky above Kaelara's northern continent shimmered violet, its distant rings glowing like pale brushstrokes across the horizon. Beautiful place to get stranded, he thought. His breath fogged inside the visor as he scanned the empty landscape. Nothing moved. No animals. No structures. Just wind-carved ridges and frozen dust stretching for miles. Then he noticed something strange about the ground ahead of him. Tracks, huge ones. Not mechanical. Not human. Ethan crouched and brushed snow away with a gloved hand. Each impression was nearly 2 feet long and deep enough to swallow his boot. Whatever made them was heavy and tall. He followed them with his eyes across the plain until they vanished behind a jagged ridge of ice about 100 yards away. The silence returned, thick and unnatural. Okay, he said quietly, standing again. Either that's a really big animal, or I just found the owner of this planet. His suit sensors ticked softly as he walked toward the ridge, each step echoing across the frozen ground. The wind began to return, whispering through the ice formations like distant voices. As Ethan climbed the ridge, he saw movement on the other side. A figure stood in the drifting snow. Tall, at least 8 feet, wrapped in dark metallic armor that caught the fading. Light like polished stone. Long silver hair whipped across her shoulders. And even from a distance, Ethan could see she was hiding part of her face behind one clawed hand. For a moment neither of them moved. Then the wind shifted again, revealing her fully. A crown, cracked but unmistakable, rested above her brow. Her skin glowed a deep blue-violet beneath the alien sky. Golden eyes locked onto his visor. Ethan blinked once, surprised not by how frightening she looked, but by how tired she seemed. He slowly raised his empty hands. "Hi," he said through the translator. "I'm guessing you didn't cause my crash." The alien woman lowered her hand just slightly, enough for Ethan to glimpse a long scar across her cheek. Her voice came through his suit speakers a second later, low and careful. "Human," she said, studying him as though the word itself were unfamiliar. Ethan tilted his head. Then, without thinking too hard about it, he smiled inside his helmet and said the first honest thing that came to mind. "You know," he said gently, "you're actually pretty beautiful." The reaction was immediate. The alien queen stiffened as if the cold itself had spoken. Her golden eyes widened, not with anger, but disbelief. Snow drifted silently between them as she whispered, almost to herself, "Why? Would a human say such a thing?" The wind returned slowly, brushing across the frozen plain like a quiet warning. Ethan Carter stood still on the ridge, his breath fogging the inside of his visor, while the tall alien woman continued staring at him as if he had just spoken a language that did not exist. Snow drifted between them in soft spirals, settling on the dark plates of her armor and the cracked crown resting above her brow. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger but confusion, the kind that comes when a belief that has lasted a lifetime suddenly begins to fracture. Ethan shifted his weight, boots crunching lightly against the glassy ice beneath him. The silence stretched for several seconds before she finally spoke again. Her voice came through the translator slowly, each word measured and careful. "Human," she said, "why would you say something that is clearly untrue?" Ethan tilted his head slightly. The translator had rendered her tone almost perfectly, calm, but edged with something deeper, something defensive. He lifted his hands a little higher, palms open. so she could see he carried nothing dangerous. I did not mean it as a joke, he replied. Where I come from, calling someone beautiful is not an insult. The alien queen studied him for a long moment. The wind tugged at her silver hair, revealing more of the long scar that crossed one side of her face. Even beneath the cold blue light of the alien sky, Ethan could see the texture of it, a mark that had healed long ago but never disappeared. Her hand instinctively moved toward it, as if she had spent years hiding it from every pair of eyes she met. Beautiful, she repeated quietly, as though testing the shape of the word. Her gaze shifted away from him briefly, toward the endless frozen horizon stretching across the plains of Kaelara. On my world, she continued, such words are given only to those whose faces are flawless. Those who carry scars are reminders of failure. Ethan frowned slightly behind his helmet. Failure. The words sounded heavy coming from someone who wore a crown. He glanced again at the cracked metal resting above her head, then back to the exhaustion he had seen in her eyes earlier. The two details did not match. That sounds like a pretty lonely way to run a civilization, he said gently. Her eyes snapped back to him immediately, surprised by the answer. You speak very freely for someone who has just arrived on a world that is not your own. Ethan shrugged lightly. I crash-landed on a frozen planet 6 billion miles from home. At this point, honesty seems like the safest strategy. For a brief second, something shifted in her expression, the faintest hint of curiosity pushing through the rigid composure of royalty. The wind howled again across the ridge, carrying fine ice crystals that tapped softly against Ethan's visor. His suit temperature indicator flickered a warning as the cold deepened. The alien queen noticed it immediately. Your survival systems are failing, she said quietly. Ethan glanced down at the blinking display on his wrist. It is nothing dramatic, he replied. Just very cold out here. Her gaze moved across the wreckage of his shuttle behind him, half buried in the snow. Then back to him. Human, she said slowly. You have come to my world at a dangerous time. Ethan raised an eyebrow inside his helmet. Dangerous? How? The queen hesitated, her eyes scanning the distant horizon where the frozen plains disappeared into drifting fog. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than before. There are those who believe their queen should not exist anymore. Ethan looked at her, then at the scar across her face again, and finally back at the crown resting on her head. Well, he said quietly, that seems like their mistake. And for the first time since he had seen her standing in the storm, the alien queen did not immediately look away. The wind grew sharper across the ridge as the alien queen remained still, her tall figure silhouetted against the violet sky of Kaelara. Ethan Carter could hear the quiet hum of his suit struggling to keep up with the falling temperature, a soft mechanical whisper in his ears reminding him that the cold out here did not forgive mistakes. The warning indicator flickered again on his wrist display, minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit now, and dropping. Ethan shifted slightly, rolling his shoulders to keep the stiffness out of his joints, but his attention never left the towering woman standing a few yards away. The alien queen watched him with a strange intensity, as though she was trying to solve a puzzle that had no obvious answer. A moment passed before she spoke again. You said something earlier that does not make sense. Human, she said slowly. You said their mistake. Ethan nodded a little, frost gathering along the edges of his visor. That is right. If someone looks at a queen who clearly survived something terrible and calls her a failure, I would say they are the ones who missed the point. The queen studied him carefully, golden eyes reflecting the pale light of the distant rings above the planet. The wind shifted again, pushing long strands of her silver hair across the scar on her cheek. This time she did not hide it. On my world, she said quietly, scars are not symbols of survival. They are reminders that a leader allowed harm to reach them. Ethan let out a slow breath that fogged the inside of his helmet. That seems like a strange rule, he said. Where I come from, the people who carry scars are usually the ones who stood between danger and everyone else. Her eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity replacing some of the guarded distance in her posture. You assume much about something you do not understand. Ethan shrugged lightly. Maybe, but you did not correct me either. The queen did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the distant horizon. Far away across the frozen plain, faint shapes moved through the drifting fog. They were still too distant for Ethan to identify clearly, but the queen noticed them instantly. Her posture stiffened, shoulders straightening beneath the dark armor she wore. Ethan followed her gaze. You expecting company? He asked. The Queen remained silent for a few seconds before answering. They search for me every day. Ethan looked back at her. That sounds exhausting. She exhaled slowly, a faint cloud of pale vapor escaping into the icy air. A queen who no longer inspires confidence invites challengers. Ethan glanced again toward the distant moving shapes. They did not look like animals. The steady rhythm suggested vehicles or patrol units crossing the ice. Well, he said calmly, if they are looking for you, standing on top of a ridge in the open might not be the best strategy. The Queen turned back toward him, surprised by the practicality of the suggestion. And what would you suggest, human explorer who fell out of the sky? Ethan pointed a thumb toward the half-buried shuttle behind him. There is a narrow service hatch underneath the left engine compartment. The crash jammed the main door, but the lower bay still opens. It is not warm inside, but it blocks the wind and keeps us out of sight. The Queen hesitated. You would allow the ruler of an alien civilization inside your vessel without knowing my intentions. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You already told me people are hunting you. That puts us on the same team for now. For the first time since their conversation began, the alien queen looked genuinely uncertain. Her golden eyes searched his visor, trying to find some hidden motive. Instead, she only saw the reflection of her own scarred face staring back. The human spoke again, his voice calm despite the growing cold. Where I come from, he said, if someone needs shelter in a storm, you open the door first and ask questions later. The Queen looked at him for another long moment. Then, slowly, she stepped toward the damaged shuttle. The wind howled louder across the frozen ridge. As Ethan Carter crouched beside the damaged shuttle, brushing thick ice away from a narrow maintenance panel beneath the left engine housing, the metal groaned softly under his gloved hands, stiff from the brutal cold that had wrapped the planet in silence for what felt like centuries. Behind him, the tall alien queen approached with slow, measured steps, each movement graceful despite the heavy armor she wore. Her golden eyes never left the distant shapes moving through the pale fog across the plains. They were still far away, but the steady rhythm of their movement told her enough. They were searching carefully. Ethan finally pried the hatch loose with a metallic snap and swung it open. A breath of colder air drifted from inside the dark compartment, carrying the faint scent of machine oil and frozen circuits. It is not luxurious, he said, leaning back slightly so the Queen could see the opening, but it is better than becoming a statue out here. The Queen stopped beside him, her towering frame casting a long shadow over the damaged hull. For a moment, she simply stared at the opening, clearly weighing something far more complicated than the small shelter it offered. You trust very easily for someone alone on a foreign world, she said quietly. Ethan wiped frost from his visor with the back of his glove. Not exactly trust, he replied. More like practical timing. If someone is hunting you, they probably will not expect you to hide inside the wreckage of the only human ship for a few million miles. The Queen considered that. The faint glow of the distant patrol shapes flickered again across the horizon, now slightly closer. Her eyes narrowed. Then, without another word, she lowered herself carefully and stepped through the opening into the dark maintenance bay. Ethan followed a second later, pulling the hatch closed behind them. The sudden absence of wind made the silence inside the shuttle feel almost unnatural. The space was cramped, barely tall enough for Ethan to crouch comfortably, and far too small for someone of the Queen's height to stand upright. Dim emergency lights flickered weakly along the inner wall, painting the metal surfaces in soft amber tones. For the first time since Ethan had seen her outside, the Queen relaxed her posture slightly. Without the storm tearing at her armor and hair, she seemed less like a distant ruler and more like a person who had simply been standing in the cold too long. Ethan leaned back against a bulkhead panel and tapped a control on his wrist, dimming his suit's external signal. That should reduce the heat signature a little, he said. The Queen observed the motion carefully. Your equipment is impressive for such a young species. Ethan gave a small shrug. We make up for experience with stubborn engineering. The Queen looked around the small compartment, her gaze resting briefly on the cracked instrument panels and exposed wiring where the crash had torn through the outer systems. Your ship is injured, she said softly. Ethan chuckled quietly. That is one way to describe it. She turned her attention back to him, her golden eyes reflecting the dim interior lights. Earlier you spoke of beauty as though the word means something different to humans. Ethan tilted his head slightly. It does. Where I come from, beauty is not just about a perfect face. Sometimes it is about what someone survived. The Queen's expression shifted again, thoughtful now. Her hand rose unconsciously toward the scar along her cheek before stopping halfway. Outside the hull, faint vibrations rolled across the frozen ground as the distant patrols passed somewhere beyond the ridge. The Queen listened to the sound fading into the storm, then looked back at the human who had offered her shelter without hesitation. "Human Ethan Carter," she said slowly, "you speak as though scars should be honored." Ethan smiled faintly inside his helmet. "Where I come from," he answered, "they usually mean someone stood their ground when it mattered most." The Queen fell silent, and for the first time in many years, the meaning of that idea did not feel impossible to imagine. The dim emergency lights inside the shuttle flickered softly as the storm continued to roar outside, the metal hull creaking now and then under the pressure of the alien wind. Ethan Carter remained seated against the bulkhead, watching faint frost slowly spread across the edges of the small viewport beside him. Even inside the damaged craft, the temperature had fallen below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the thin warmth generated by his suit struggled to hold the cold at bay. Across the cramped maintenance bay, the alien Queen sat carefully with her head slightly lowered so it would not touch the ceiling panels. Without the storm around her, the details of her presence became clearer. Her armor was not merely ceremonial. It carried the marks of long use, fine lines and faint fractures across the metallic surface that spoke of years rather than a single battle. The cracked crown resting above her silver hair looked older still. Ethan glanced at it briefly, then back at her face where the long scar traced a pale line across the blue-violet skin of her cheek. The Queen noticed his gaze but did not turn away this time. "Your species measures beauty by survival," she said quietly, as though the idea still felt unfamiliar on her tongue. Ethan nodded slightly. "Not always," he replied, "but the people who matter usually do." The Queen folded her hands slowly in her lap, considering that answer with careful attention. "On Kaelara," she said, "rulers are chosen for perfection. Their appearance represents stability. A scar suggests weakness, and weakness invites doubt." Ethan tilted his head. "And doubt invites challengers." "Yes," she said softly. For a moment the small compartment fell silent again except for the distant howl of wind beyond the hull. Ethan studied her posture, the weight in her shoulders, the way her eyes drifted briefly toward the metal floor before lifting again. He had seen that same look before on exhausted engineers after months in deep space, or on soldiers returning home after carrying too much responsibility for too long. It was the look of someone who had spent years being strong for everyone else. "What is your name?" Ethan asked suddenly. The Queen blinked once, slightly surprised by the question. "You know my title," she said. Ethan gave a small shrug. "Titles are useful for ceremonies. Names are better for conversations." The Queen was quiet for several seconds before answering. "Laraxa," she said at last. Ethan repeated the name softly to make sure the translator had rendered it correctly. "Laraxa. That is a strong name." The Queen looked at him with faint curiosity again. "On my world, it means the one who endures the winter." Ethan smiled slightly. "That seems appropriate considering the weather outside." The corner of her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but something warmer than the guarded neutrality she had carried earlier. Outside the hull, the distant vibrations of the search patrols finally faded into the storm. The ridge and frozen plains returned to silence once again. Laraxa listened carefully for a moment before relaxing her shoulders slightly. "They have passed for now," she said. Ethan leaned back against the bulkhead with a quiet sigh of relief. "That is good news for both of us." The Queen studied him again, her golden eyes reflecting the dim amber lights of the shuttle interior. "Human Ethan Carter," she said slowly, "earlier you told me that scars can be honored." Ethan nodded. "That is right." Laraxa hesitated, then raised a hand and gently brushed her fingers across the scar along her cheek, not hiding it this time, but tracing its shape as though seeing it clearly for the first time in years. "On my world," she said quietly, "this mark ended the day my people believed I could still lead them." Ethan looked at her calmly. Or maybe it was the day they forgot what leadership actually looks like. Laraxa lowered her hand slowly, the faintest flicker of something new appearing in her golden eyes. For the first time since she had been forced to wear the cracked crown, the thought that the human might be right did not sound impossible. The storm outside the shuttle continued its endless roar across the frozen plains of Kaelara, but inside the narrow maintenance bay the silence felt almost fragile, like a small pocket of calm surrounded by an ocean of cold. Ethan Carter rubbed his gloved hands together slowly, feeling the stiffness in his fingers as the temperature inside the damaged ship drifted downward again. His suit display flickered softly near his wrist, warning him that the internal heat reserves were beginning to drop. The system could keep him comfortable for several hours, but it was not designed for long nights on an alien world with half a shuttle for shelter. Across the compartment, Laraxa remained seated with her back straight despite the cramped ceiling above her. The dim amber lights reflected along the edges of her armor, turning the scratched metal plates into quiet mirrors of pale gold and bronze. She seemed calmer now than when Ethan had first seen her standing in the storm. The tension in her shoulders had eased slightly, though her eyes still carried the careful awareness of someone used to danger appearing without warning. Ethan shifted a loose cable aside with the toe of his boot and glanced toward the small diagnostic panel. Beside him, the screen flickered weakly, showing scattered system messages that looked like the electronic equivalent of a headache. Navigation offline. External sensors unreliable. Heating grid partially disabled. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his helmet. Well, that could be better, he murmured. Laraxa turned her head slightly toward him. Your vessel is speaking to you, she observed. Ethan smiled faintly. Something like that. It is complaining about the cold almost as much as I am. The Queen watched him work for a moment as he adjusted the cracked control panel with careful movements. Your species repairs machines even when the situation appears hopeless, she said thoughtfully. Ethan shrugged lightly. Machines are honest. If something is broken, you can usually fix it if you take the time to understand it. Laraxa considered that idea for several seconds before replying. That philosophy does not exist among my people when it comes to leaders. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What happens instead? Laraxa lowered her gaze briefly toward the metal floor of the compartment. When a ruler is damaged, she said quietly, they are replaced. Ethan stopped adjusting the panel for a moment and looked at her more closely. That sounds efficient, he said slowly, but not very forgiving. The Queen's golden eyes lifted again to meet his visor. Forgiveness is not considered a valuable trait among those who compete for power. Ethan leaned back against the bulkhead again, thinking about that while the wind howled faintly outside the hall. Where I come from, he said after a moment. The people who survive hard things often become the leaders others trust the most. Laraxa tilted her head slightly. Because they understand suffering. Ethan nodded. Exactly. The Queen's gaze drifted again toward the scar on her cheek, her fingers resting lightly against the metal edge of her cracked crown as though she could still feel the weight of the moment that had changed everything. For many years, she said quietly, my people believed that I had failed them. Ethan looked at her steadily. And what do you believe? Laraxa was silent for several seconds, listening to the distant wind moving across the frozen plains beyond the shuttle walls. When she finally answered, her voice carried something new beneath the quiet strength of her words. I believe them. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he said gently, sometimes the hardest thing a leader has to do is survive long enough to prove everyone else wrong. Laraxa looked at him again, her golden eyes reflecting the faint glow of the damaged shuttle lights. Outside, the storm shifted direction across the endless white horizon, but inside the small shelter something subtle had changed. For the first time in many years, the Queen of Kaelara was beginning to wonder if the human might be seeing something in her that her own people had forgotten how to recognize. The storm outside had begun to lose its fury, but the cold remained relentless, pressing against the hull of the damaged shuttle like an invisible ocean. Inside the cramped maintenance bay, Ethan Carter listened to the quiet ticking sounds of metal contracting as the temperature continued to fall. His suit display now read 8 degrees Fahrenheit inside the compartment, far warmer than the open plains outside, yet still cold enough to make every breath feel sharp in his lungs. Ethan adjusted the small diagnostic screen again, coaxing a faint pulse of power through a damaged circuit. The panel responded with a brief flicker of light before settling into a weak but stable glow. That is better, he said quietly to himself. Laraxa watched him from across the narrow space. her golden eyes following each careful movement of his hands. For someone who had never seen human technology before, she seemed to understand the patience behind his actions. "You repair this vessel piece by piece," she said thoughtfully, "even though it cannot fly again soon." Ethan leaned back slightly, flexing his fingers to warm them. "That is true," he replied. "But repairing small systems gives us options later. My people survive a lot of bad situations by building one working part at a time." Laraxa tilted her head slightly. "Options," she repeated. Ethan nodded. "If I can restore the communications grid, maybe I can send a signal to a passing exploration satellite. It might take days or even weeks, but someone could find the signal eventually." The Queen considered that carefully. "On Kaelara," she said, "patience is rarely valued during moments of crisis." Ethan smiled faintly behind his visor. "That might explain some of the problems you mentioned earlier." Laraxa did not answer immediately. Her attention drifted briefly to the narrow seam of the hatch above them, where faint frost had begun forming along the edges. Outside the storm, clouds shifted slowly across the alien sky, though neither of them could see it from inside the damaged shuttle. After a moment, she spoke again. "Human Ethan Carter," she said quietly, "earlier you asked what I believed about myself." Ethan glanced up from the diagnostic panel. "That is right." Laraxa rested her hands together thoughtfully. "For many years I believed that the scar on my face meant I had failed my people. It became a symbol that others used to question my rule." Ethan studied her expression carefully. "And now?" Laraxa hesitated, the faint glow of the amber lights reflecting in her golden eyes. "Now I wonder if the scar frightened them because it reminded them that survival sometimes requires sacrifice." Ethan nodded slowly. "That sounds closer to the truth." The Queen looked at him with renewed curiosity. "Humans speak about sacrifice with surprising calmness." Ethan leaned back against the bulkhead again. "That is because our history is full of people who had to choose between comfort and doing what was right." Laraxa absorbed that idea silently. For the first time, she seemed to examine the human not as a strange visitor from another world, but as someone carrying the weight of a very different civilization. After a moment, Ethan reached toward a small storage panel beside him and opened it. Inside was a compact thermal blanket sealed in a bright orange pack. He tossed it gently across the compartment toward her. "You might want that," he said. "It will not make the room warm, but it will help your body hold its heat." Laraxa caught the small pack easily, her eyes narrowing slightly in surprise. "You give away your only thermal equipment while your own systems are failing." Ethan shrugged lightly. "I still have the suit. Besides, where I come from, letting someone freeze in front of you is considered bad manners." For several seconds, the Queen simply stared at the small orange pack in her hands. Then she looked back at the human who had offered it without hesitation. Something shifted in her expression again, something quieter and deeper than curiosity. Outside, the frozen plains of Kaelara stretched endlessly beneath the dark sky, but inside the broken shuttle, a different kind of warmth had begun to exist, one that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the strange kindness of a species she had only just begun to understand. The small compartment of the damaged shuttle remained dim and quiet as the storm outside drifted into a long, restless whisper across the frozen plains. Frost slowly thickened along the seams of the hull, while the faint emergency lights continued their weak glow, painting the interior in shades of amber and shadow. Ethan Carter adjusted the power feed of the diagnostic panel once more before finally letting the small tool in his hand rest against the metal floor. The repair would hold for now. It was not perfect, but it was enough to keep the shuttle's minimal systems alive through the night. Across from him, Laraxa had unfolded the thermal blanket he had given her. The bright orange fabric looked strangely vivid against the dark metallic armor she wore, like a small fragment of warmth from another world. She studied the material for a moment before wrapping it carefully around her shoulders. The movement seemed unfamiliar, as though accepting comfort from someone else was not something she had practiced often. Ethan noticed the way she adjusted the blanket with quiet precision, ensuring it did not cover the cracked crown resting against her silver hair. Even now she carried herself like someone who understood that every gesture might be watched by others. Outside, the storm shifted again, sending a long vibration through the frozen ground beneath the shuttle. Laraxa lifted her head slightly, listening with the careful attention of someone who had spent years surviving uncertainty. After several seconds, she relaxed again. They are far away now, she said softly. Ethan nodded once. Good. I would prefer our first meeting to remain a private conversation instead of a diplomatic incident. The Queen studied him again, the faint glow of the emergency lights reflecting in her golden eyes. Your calmness is unusual, human Ethan Carter. Most beings would react with fear when hiding beside a ruler who is hunted by her own people. Ethan leaned back slightly against the bulkhead. Where I come from, he replied, survival situations tend to simplify things. Cold weather and broken ships make politics feel less important. Laraxa considered that carefully. In my world, politics decides survival. Ethan smiled faintly behind his visor. That sounds exhausting. The Queen did not argue. Instead, she slowly traced a finger along the seam of the thermal blanket, feeling the insulated fabric between her hands. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she looked up again. You offered this to me even though your own temperature systems are failing. Ethan glanced briefly at his wrist display where a small indicator showed the gradual loss of stored heat. It is manageable for now, he said calmly. Besides, you are the one without a suit. Laraxa tilted her head slightly. On Kaelara, rulers rarely receive kindness without a price attached. Ethan shrugged lightly. That probably explains why you looked so suspicious earlier. The Queen allowed a small pause before responding. I am still suspicious. Ethan chuckled quietly. Fair enough. Outside the shuttle, the sky above Kaelara had begun to clear slightly as the storm clouds shifted toward the distant mountains. Neither of them could see it from inside the narrow maintenance bay, but the faint light filtering through the hull suggested that the long alien night was slowly changing. Laraxa noticed the shift in brightness along the metal walls. The storm is weakening, she observed. Ethan followed her gaze toward the faint light seeping through the seams of the hatch. That might give us a window to plan our next move. The Queen looked at him with renewed curiosity. You speak as though we are partners in this situation. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Well, we are both stuck on the same frozen planet right now. That counts as a temporary alliance in my book. Laraxa watched him carefully for several seconds, her expression thoughtful rather than guarded this time. Human Ethan Carter, she said quietly, you are unlike the stories my people tell about your species. Ethan smiled faintly again. Stories about humans usually focus on our worst moments. Laraxa's golden eyes softened slightly as she studied him across the small compartment. Perhaps, she said slowly, my people have been listening to the wrong stories. And in the quiet warmth of that unlikely shelter, the idea no longer sounded impossible. The faint light filtering through the seams of the damaged shuttle slowly grew stronger as the storm above Kaelara drifted farther across the frozen horizon. The violent wind that had once screamed across the plains had softened into a distant whisper, leaving the endless ice fields outside wrapped in a quiet that felt almost ancient. Inside the cramped maintenance bay, Ethan Carter watched the diagnostic panel pulse softly with weak but steady power. The small repairs he had made earlier were holding, at least for now. The temperature inside the shuttle had stabilized at 12 degrees Fahrenheit, still bitterly cold but survivable. Across from him, Laraxa adjusted the thermal blanket around her shoulders again. The bright fabric looked strangely human against the dark elegance of her alien armor, and for a moment Ethan realized how unusual the situation truly was. A stranded human engineer and a hunted alien queen sharing shelter inside a broken exploration shuttle on a world neither of them fully controlled. Laraxa seemed to be thinking something similar. Her golden eyes moved slowly across the interior of the shuttle, studying every detail with careful curiosity. Your species builds machines that are both fragile and resilient, she said thoughtfully. Ethan raised an eyebrow behind his visor. That is a polite way to describe human engineering. The Queen tilted her head slightly. Your vessel is damaged beyond immediate repair, yet you continue to restore small systems one by one as if you believe the ship will eventually recover. Ethan nodded slowly. That is how most human problems get solved. One working piece at a time. Laraxa considered that idea quietly. Outside, the storm clouds shifted again, and faint pale light from the distant ringed planet above Kaelara began to glow through the cracks in the hull. The subtle brightness made the scar across the Queen's cheek more visible than before. She noticed Ethan glance toward it again, but this time there was no discomfort in her expression. Instead, she spoke with quiet curiosity. Earlier you said scars can mean someone stood their ground when it mattered most. Ethan leaned back slightly. That is right. Laraxa lowered her hand to rest against the metal floor beside her. On my world, she said, this scar was the moment everything changed. Ethan waited patiently. The Queen's voice softened as she continued. Years ago, our northern cities faced a storm far worse than the one outside this shuttle. Entire settlements were at risk of being lost beneath the ice winds. I led the evacuation myself. Ethan studied her expression carefully. And you were injured during that effort. Laraxa nodded slowly. The storm tore through our defenses faster than expected. Many of my advisors believed the evacuation should be abandoned to preserve the capital. Ethan frowned slightly. But you did not abandon them. The Queen's golden eyes lifted to meet his. Visor. No ruler should abandon their people when the world becomes dangerous. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounds like leadership to me. Laraxa looked away briefly, her gaze drifting toward the faint glow of light seeping through the seams of the shuttle hull. When the storm ended, she continued quietly. Many lives had been saved. But my injury became the only thing my council wished to discuss. Ethan shook his head slowly. Let me guess. They saw the scar and decided you were no longer perfect enough to represent stability. Laraxa looked back at him, surprised by how easily he understood. Yes. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The quiet inside the shuttle felt different now, heavier with meaning. Ethan finally broke the silence. Where I come from, the story would be told differently. Laraxa studied him carefully. How would your people tell it? Ethan met her gaze calmly. They would say their queen walked into the storm so others could walk out alive. The Queen's golden eyes remained fixed on him as those words settled into the quiet space between them. For the first time in years, the memory of that storm no longer felt like a mark of failure. Instead, it felt like something else entirely, something the human had seen immediately that her own people had forgotten how to recognize. The faint glow of Kaelara's distant rings slowly brightened the frozen world outside the damaged shuttle as the long storm finally drifted beyond the horizon. Inside the narrow maintenance bay, the quiet had deepened into something almost reflective. Ethan Carter leaned against the cold bulkhead, watching the small diagnostic panel pulse with weak but steady power. The system readings were not impressive, but they were enough. The communication array was beginning to stabilize, and if the signal amplifier cooperated, he might eventually send a distress beacon into orbit. Across from him, Laraxa remained seated with the bright thermal blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The orange fabric reflected softly against the dark metal interior, casting warm tones across the alien queen's armor and silver hair. Her golden eyes remained thoughtful, as if the story she had just told was still echoing somewhere in her mind. For many years, she said quietly after a long silence, I believe the council's judgment was correct. Ethan looked at her. You believed the scar meant you had failed them. Laraxa nodded slowly. My advisors spoke often about perfection and stability. They said the image of a ruler must never change. Ethan folded his arms slightly against the cold. That sounds like a fragile system. Laraxa studied him with mild curiosity. Explain. Ethan tilted his head thoughtfully. If a civilization believes its leader must be perfect, then the first sign of real hardship will break that illusion. He gestured gently toward the faint scar on her cheek. But survival is not perfect. It is messy. It leaves marks. Laraxa lowered her gaze briefly, considering his words. The small compartment remained quiet except for the faint ticking of cooling metal along the hull. Outside, pale light from the ringed planet above Kaelara reflected across the frozen plains like a distant ocean of glass. Ethan finally pushed himself away from the bulkhead and walked toward the small viewport, seen near the hatch. A thin blade of light slipped through the crack in the metal, suggesting that the sky beyond had begun to clear. He glanced back toward Laraxa. It looks like the storm is finally moving on. The Queen followed his gaze toward the faint light. On Kaelara, she said softly, storms reveal more than they hide. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. How so? Laraxa rested her hand gently along the edge of the thermal blanket. When the wind strips the land of snow, it reveals what was buried beneath it. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds like a metaphor if I have ever heard one. Laraxa allowed the faintest hint of a smile, the expression small but genuine. Perhaps it is. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The strange calm between them felt less like the awkward silence of strangers and more like the quiet understanding that forms between two people who have shared an unexpected moment of honesty. Then Ethan's wrist display emitted a sudden soft tone. He glanced down quickly. The communication grid flickered with a brief pulse of activity before stabilizing again. Well, he said quietly, that is interesting. Laraxa straightened slightly. Your vessel has recovered another system. Ethan nodded. Not fully, but the transmitter is beginning to respond. If I can boost the signal, a satellite might catch it eventually. The Queen studied him carefully. And when your people arrive, you will leave Kaelara. Ethan shrugged lightly. That is usually how rescue works. Laraxa looked down at the floor again, her expression thoughtful rather than distant. Then she spoke in a softer voice than before. Human Ethan Carter, when you leave this world, what story will you tell about the Queen you found hiding inside your broken ship? Ethan paused for a moment before answering. I will tell them I met someone who walked into a storm so her people could walk out of it. Laraxa looked at him again, her golden eyes reflecting the faint new light seeping through the hall. And for the first time since that distant storm years ago, the title she carried no longer felt like a burden she had to defend. Instead, it felt like something she had truly earned. The faint signal pulse from the shuttle's communication panel continued to blink softly in the dim maintenance bay, each small flash reflecting off the metal walls like a quiet heartbeat in the frozen silence. Ethan Carter leaned closer to the cracked console, adjusting a narrow circuit connection with careful fingers while his breath fogged faintly inside his visor. Outside the damaged hull, Kaelara had finally revealed its true sky again. The storm clouds had drifted beyond the distant ridges, leaving the frozen plains stretched beneath a vast violet horizon where the enormous rings of the gas giant above shimmered like pale rivers of light. Inside the shuttle the temperature remained cold, but the absence of the storm made the quiet feel calmer rather than threatening. Across from him, Laraxa watched the small blinking transmitter with steady curiosity. The communication signal repeats every 30 seconds, she observed softly. Ethan nodded without looking up. That is right. Each burst increases the chance that something in orbit will notice it. The Queen tilted her head slightly. Your people rely heavily on distant machines to watch the stars. Ethan allowed a small smile. Humans are very good at building eyes that never blink. Laraxa considered that idea for several seconds while the transmitter released another faint pulse of light. The glow briefly illuminated the scar along her cheek before fading again. For a moment, she studied her reflection in the polished metal panel beside her. Then she looked back toward Ethan. Human Ethan Carter, she said slowly, when your signal reaches the stars, your people will know where you are. Ethan nodded. Eventually, yes. Laraxa's voice remained calm, but something thoughtful moved beneath it. And when they arrive, your journey on this world will end. Ethan leaned back slightly from the console. That is the usual plan when rescue shows up. The Queen folded her hands loosely in her lap, the bright thermal blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The orange fabric looked less strange now against the dark interior of the shuttle, as if the color had slowly become part of the quiet space they shared. My people would consider this moment very unusual, she said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. How so? Laraxa's golden eyes met his visor. A ruler hiding beside a stranger who arrived from the sky, discussing survival and scars while the search patrols pass beyond the horizon. Ethan chuckled softly. When you say it like that, it does sound a little strange. The Queen allowed the faintest hint of amusement to appear in her expression. Yet this conversation has changed something important. Ethan tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? Laraxa lifted her hand again and touched the scar along her cheek, though this time the gesture carried none of the hesitation it once had. For years I believed this mark represented failure, she said. My council repeated that belief so often that eventually I accepted it as truth. Ethan studied her quietly. And now? Laraxa looked toward the narrow seam of light shining through the hatch, where the clearing sky of Kaelara glowed softly against the ice beyond the shuttle. Now I wonder if the scar frightened them because it reminded them that survival sometimes requires courage they do not possess. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounds like a very human way to look at things. The Queen turned back toward him with renewed curiosity. Humans speak often about courage, yet your species is still young among the stars. Ethan shrugged lightly. Being young means we make a lot of mistakes, but it also means we are not afraid to question old ideas. Laraxa remained silent for several seconds while the transmitter released another gentle pulse into the sky above Kaelara. Then she spoke again, her voice softer than before. Human Ethan Carter, if your signal reaches the stars and rescue comes for you, will you remember this meeting? Ethan leaned back against the bulkhead and looked at her calmly. I will remember the queen who walked into a storm to save her people. Laraxa held his gaze for a long moment, the golden light in her eyes steady and thoughtful. Outside, the frozen plains stretched endlessly beneath the clearing sky. And for the first time in many years, the future of Kaelara felt less like a struggle she had already lost, and more like a story that had not yet finished being written. The soft pulse of the shuttle's transmitter continued to echo through the narrow maintenance bay, each signal rising quietly toward the sky above Kaelara like a patient call into the darkness of space. Ethan Carter watched the blinking indicator for several seconds before leaning back against the cold metal wall again. The system was holding steady, and that small success made the broken vessel feel a little less like a grave and a little more like a temporary shelter. Outside the hull, the alien world had changed completely. The storm that had once buried the plains beneath roaring wine now existed only as a distant gray band along the horizon. Above the frozen landscape, the immense rings of the gas giant stretched across the sky like glowing highways of ice, casting pale light over the endless white terrain. Even inside the shuttle, the reflection of that light slipped through the seams of the metal, soft and steady. Laraxa noticed it immediately. She turned her head toward the thin line of brightness near the hatch and watched it carefully. The night is ending, she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze and nodded. Looks like the planet decided to give us a break. The queen remained still for a moment, listening to the quiet world outside. Then she spoke again in a thoughtful voice. On Kaelara, the arrival of morning after a great storm is considered a moment of judgment. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Judgment from who? Laraxa looked down briefly before answering. From the people who survived the storm. Ethan considered that idea while the transmitter released another faint pulse of light. That sounds like a difficult tradition for leaders. Laraxa's golden eyes lifted again. It is meant to remind rulers that survival is never guaranteed. Ethan gave a small nod of understanding. That makes sense. For several seconds they both listened to the silence around them. Then Ethan pushed himself up from the bulkhead and walked back toward the control panel. The communication signal had grown slightly stronger, and the receiver showed faint signs of activity. From orbit, something out there might already be listening. He adjusted a dial carefully and watched the signal stabilize. Across the small compartment, Laraxa observed his work with the same quiet curiosity she had shown all night. Human Ethan Carter, she said slowly, earlier you told me that your people value those who survive hardship. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. That is true. Laraxa studied him carefully. Then perhaps your people would understand something my own council refused to see. Ethan rested his hand on the console. What is that? The queen raised her chin slightly, the cracked crown catching a thin beam of light from the opening seam of the hatch. That a ruler who has faced the storm is stronger than one who only watches it from a palace window. Ethan smiled faintly behind his visor. Now that definitely sounds like leadership. Laraxa looked toward the light again, thoughtful rather than uncertain. The faint glow of morning spread slowly across the frozen plains outside, reflecting off the ice fields like a second sky beneath their feet. For the first time since the council had questioned her rule, the future of Kaelara no longer seemed locked inside a single moment of doubt. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a new question. She turned back toward Ethan once more. Human Ethan Carter, she said quietly, when the sky finally answers your signal and your people come for you, the story you carry away from this world may reach farther than you realize. Ethan studied her for a moment before responding. Stories tend to travel farther than ships sometimes. Laraxa allowed a faint, thoughtful smile as the transmitter released another quiet pulse into the brightening sky above Kaelara, and for the first time in many years the dawn of this frozen world felt less like a reminder of past judgment and more like the beginning of something she had not yet imagined. The pale morning light of Kaelara continued to grow stronger as it spilled across the frozen plains outside the damaged shuttle, turning the endless ice fields into a quiet sea of silver and violet reflections. Inside the narrow maintenance bay, The small transmitter panel released another steady pulse of signal toward the sky above, the rhythmic glow now almost comforting in its persistence. Ethan Carter stood beside the console, watching the receiver display carefully as faint lines of data began to flicker across the cracked screen. Somewhere far above the planet, something had finally answered. The signal was weak and distant, but it was real. Ethan exhaled slowly and leaned closer to the panel, adjusting the amplifier with careful precision. The response signal strengthened slightly, stabilizing into a narrow band of communication. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like somebody out there finally heard us." Across the compartment, Laraxa rose slowly from her seated position, the bright thermal blanket still resting around her shoulders. Even in the cramped interior of the shuttle, her presence carried the calm gravity of someone used to command. She stepped closer to the narrow seam of the hatch where morning light poured through and looked out across the silent world beyond. The sky above Kaelara had cleared completely now. The enormous rings of the gas giant arched across the heavens like frozen rivers of light, and the distant horizon shimmered beneath the rising glow of the planet's sun. For a long moment, Laraxa said nothing. Then she spoke softly. "The storm has ended." Ethan glanced toward her. "That it has." Laraxa turned slightly, her golden eyes reflecting the light that filled the compartment. "On my world," she said quietly, "the first morning after a great storm is when rulers must face their people again." Ethan folded his arms loosely against the cold. "Sounds like today might be an important day for you." The Queen looked back toward the horizon, where faint shapes of distant structures were barely visible across the frozen plains. "My people will still question my rule," she said calmly. "The council will remind them of my scar and the doubts they planted." Ethan studied her expression carefully. "And what will you remind them of?" Laraxa was silent for a moment. Then she lifted her hand and touched the scar along her cheek, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty. "I will remind them that their queen walked into the storm when others feared to stand." Ethan smiled faintly behind his visor. "That is a good message." The transmitter released another signal pulse, and this time the receiver panel responded with a stronger stream of data. A rescue beacon acknowledgement had been returned. Ethan glanced at the screen and nodded. "Looks like help is officially on the way." Laraxa turned toward him again. "Your journey on Kaelara will soon end, human Ethan Carter." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Temporary visits to frozen planets were never part of my long-term plans anyway." The Queen studied him for a moment longer. Then she slowly removed the bright thermal blanket from her shoulders and folded it carefully before placing it on the console beside him. "Your kindness will remain with me long after you leave this world," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head gently. "That was just basic survival courtesy where I come from." Laraxa allowed a small, thoughtful smile. "Perhaps that is why your species travels so far among the stars." For a few seconds they stood together in the quiet glow of Kaelara's morning. Outside, the frozen plains stretched endlessly beneath the widening sky, no longer a place of hiding, but a world preparing to awaken again. Finally, Laraxa stepped toward the hatch and opened it slowly. Cold morning air flowed into the shuttle, carrying the clear brightness of the new day. She paused at the threshold and looked back once more. "Human Ethan Carter," she said softly, "when you first saw me in the storm, you called me beautiful." Ethan nodded. "I remember." Laraxa held his gaze for a long moment, the light of the rising sun reflecting in her golden eyes. Then she asked quietly, "Do you still believe that?" Ethan smiled behind his visor, the answer simple and certain. "I never stopped."